Hey, what is going on, my natural killer cells? It is January 15th, 2022. We're already done with half of January. Man, January is blazing by, you know what I mean? Yeah, I stayed up last night playing video games. Sue me. I don't know. I feel like I have it in my system and I just got to get it out every once in a while. Though I promised this year I wouldn't. There's just one I had to finish up. It was one of those visual novel games that I spent a lot of time doing and not a lot of return on my investment. So I'm gonna have to figure out a way to make those games work out for me. But what will give me a return on my investment is talking about autoimmunity. So that's the topic of today's lecture, right? Yeah, so you all know about autoimmunity, even if you don't study the immune system. Um, Autoimmunity, it's a common source of disease in people, and the more I study about, study things about the immune system, the more I realize the immune system itself is doing so many weaponized and doing so many things against itself, specifically the innate immune system in most cases, is really, it's dumb, and it's very destructive to its own body. I think to myself, like in a world where intelligence behind creation and things like that is debated, like how a person's body can kill them from an autoimmune disease is strange to me, right? Like, but there are reasons for that, and really because that's why you have protections against that. The body itself, evolution has even created protections against autoimmune diseases and the like. But enough. Let's get a little into it. So there are a lot of there are three major reasons why autoimmunity can occur, but there are a lot of manifestations, complex manifestations of autoimmunity in autoimmune disease. But the first, like this diagram on the right here, this Venn diagram kind of gives you an indication of the sources of autoimmunity and essentially, how these sources overlap to cause autoimmune disease in terms of what are the, what are the major reasons. And so genetics is one reason, right? So genetics is probably the most straightforward reason for autoimmunity. It basically, when your genes have gene locuses where self antigens are determined, right? Like you have genes for certain self antigens. People do. And the self antigens are basically, if you remember how an immune cell tells the body, tells it tells whether a cell is a pathogen or infected, or whether it's just part of the body. How the innate immune system does right off the bat. So the antigen is presented on the major histocompatibility complex, and then when a T cell bumps into this antigen, the T cell receptor will determine whether this thing is a pathogen or not, and how it determines that is whether a self-antigen is placed on this MHC. Okay, but the thing is, what happens is that sometimes your body doesn't create those self-antigens. So we talked about yesterday how an exercise in autoimmunity, understand a simple example, straightforward and very well known one that isn't often associated with autoimmunity, but it's blood transfusions, right? I mean, if you take someone's blood from another individual who's not compatible with blood in your own system due to your own genetically determined antigens, like type A can't accept type B blood, type B can't accept type A blood, etc., then there's going to be attack on the immune system against, what are essentially now your own blood cells, but your body doesn't view it that way, or your innate immune system doesn't view it that way. So the same thing can occur in autoimmune diseases that, it's the same essential thing for other cells besides blood cells, where the self-antigens are not expressed due to genetic abnormalities. And presumably most humans have some kind of genetic, have similar primordial or relatively, historically selected for self-antigens on their genes. So, yeah, I mean, so that's one major thing. The next thing that is kind of the in part in the Venn diagram of autoimmunity is the autoantibody production due to pathogenic cleverness. That's what I want to call it. An example is if you look up autoimmunity and strep. Okay, so basically, autoimmunity, stress. So your body ingest ingest macrophages and present the epitope of the antigen that they digested and pulled from the macrophage, from the bacteria digested to the surface of its cell. Okay, so that's the antigen presenting process, right? So what happens is sometimes these antigens, the antigens that your body produces, the self antigens, are actually sometimes similar, too similar to antigens that are produced when a macrophage digests a pathogen and takes a part of an active site of the bacterial fragment or something along to display as its epitope. It's actually interesting. A question on my mind is how are epitopes determined from an entire antigen by your immune system, and are the epitopes always the same? There's tons of questions there, but anyway, in this particular case, when an epitope is displayed on your MHC class 2 cells and MHC class 1, what happens is that your antibodies are the macrophages and the other ingesting cells, like neutrophils, etc., or other AP or presenting cells like T cells, whatnot. They interact with this presented antigen, and they believe that it's actually a pathogenic antigen, right? And so your antibodies don't only attack the antibodies from the strep, which is a disease that this occurs in quite frequently, but also attack your own cells, because it sees your own cells as being infectious due to the antigens epitopes of the antigens being too similar from the strep cells to from the strep pathogen to your own body cells. And this is kind of interesting, because one way this is where you get into the complex of autoimmunity, complex manifestation of autoimmunity. Even though this is considered a basic example, is when you inhale strep, right? Specifically G group strep, right? Or group A strep gas, right? And that's what it's abbreviated as. The bacteria, the bacteria, right? They go into your nose, and then your T cells, there's an abundance of helper T cells that are produced within your nose, which break down this bacteria, right? But then what happens is the T cells produce antibodies. And these antibodies happen to be autoantibodies. So, that's bad. But what's even worse is that these T cells somehow find their way into your brain. Okay, so when your T cells get into your brain, they start to release pro-inflammatory cytokines there, right? Damn T cells going where they shouldn't. And that's the thing. That's one other thing I skipped, that the brain and other parts of your body are considered immunoprivileged, so they don't normally have interaction with your innate immune system. In the case of the brain, your brain actually has its certain own type of immune system. It has immune system analogs like to macrophages and things like that. And one example is called a microglia. Okay, we'll learn about that later, but essentially microglia have a similar immune response, and they also have a cytokine emission, right? So pro-inflammatory cytokine emission. The issue is when the T cells overstimulate the emission of pro-inflammatory cytokines from the microglia and themselves, then they start to break down the blood-brain barrier, because your blood-brain barrier is a piece of epithelium which prevents impingements from the rest of your body into your brain, or impingements from the blood into your brain. And epithelium apparently can be damaged by cytokines by destroying the epithelial cells T junctions, which are the pieces that hold together different cells of the epithelium. Okay, it's a similar process to how inflammation works. The leakiness of the blood epithelium is required in order to allow cells to enter your bloodstream to diapedesis. This is part of your standard immune response. Okay, and this is talking about places where your body's injured, except these pro-inflammatory cytokines that are emitted in your brain open up the blood-brain barrier, and at that point, when the blood-brain barrier is opened up sufficiently enough, what sneaks through are those autoantibodies, right, that were created as an immune response, adaptive immune response to the strep. And those autoantibodies, again, think your own cells are pathogens, so they will bind to your cells and cause, they'll cause immune responses, because once they themselves will agglutinate, they themselves will slow down cells. They will also act as opsonization tags, which call other cells over, and which there'll be chemotactic agents which will cause macrophages to get into your system, and then those will start, or killer T cells, and those will start, perforating your healthy brain cells, and that's it. That's all she wrote. So, that's a disease, and it affects children apparently a lot. So that's another case of autoimmunity. Autoimmunity, and allergies too are another manifestation of autoimmunity. When you have an increased histamine response due to an allergen, which your body sees as an antigen, or as a pathogenic antigen, because genetically, like in the case of celiac disease, and genetically you don't have the marker to distinguish between. You don't have the genetic code, or you have mutations in your genetic code that don't allow for translation of the genes and creation of the particular self-antigens, which allow for your cells to recognize the allergen, and thus things will, you have inflammation responses and all kinds of immune responses, autoimmune responses. So that was quite a bit for this initial video. As you can see, I think I'm getting more of the immune system. Another thing I do want to eventually talk about is immunoprivilege, right? And I did touch on that with the brain, right? And you might be wondering, if you've never heard of the term, what is it and why is it there? And it's really interesting actually to me, because I didn't know about this, but before, there's organs, there's tissue in the body which are isolated from your immune system. Your immune system normally has no idea what this tissue, has no interaction with this tissue. So essentially the tissue, and for whatever reason, this tissue, and whatever reason that's promoted by the body, this is not a passive process by any means. There are no antigens or self-antigens within the immunoprivileged cells, right? So essentially immunoprivileged cells, there are interesting pros and cons to having them. In the case of an eye, which, and you might ask, why is a site immunoprivileged? Well, something interesting is that the eye, for instance, it could be very case specific, but the eye is very sensitive, right? Then remember, the immune system just attacks and attacks and attacks and attacks. The innate immunity throws out proteolytic enzymes, it digests things, it just drills through things, and that's basically when it just can't do a simple detection, right? A simple antigenic detection. If your immunoprivileged sites aren't exposed to these antigens, what's going to happen is that, they're not going to have a defense against these cells, or they're not going to have their passport, so to speak. And then if somehow the killer cells or TH cells, they enter the immunoprivileged site, which is possible, again, that's in a mechanism that, in the same way I described how the blood-brain barrier is circumvented through the nasal passageways by the Th17 cells, the same thing with the eye. There could be a way that there are ways that these cells leak into the eye. And what happened, like during damage and other situations to one eye, and what'll happen is then your one eye damage could cause you to damage the other eye, because then your immune cells start to create antibodies against your eye cells, and you could go blind basically. And I mean, the whole point of immunoprivilege was to protect the already sensitive cells of the eye from being indiscriminately attacked by the innate immune system. It's just the environment's, I guess, too caustic, so natural selection had opted to keep the eye an immunoprivileged site. Okay, so I've gone into a lot, and of course there's a lot to talk about in autoimmunity, but I'll leave it there for today, and thanks for watching. I'll see you later.